The birth of the Nephilim was not a coincidence. It was part of a dark and calculated plan to prevent the birth of Jesus. Sounds unbelievable, right? But trust me, this is one hidden truth most people don't know. Before we dive into this video, welcome to the Lore Library, where we peel back the layers of biblical history to reveal hidden truths and fascinating stories. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing, and we promise to keep bringing you engaging and enlightening videos. Today, we're diving deep into the real reason the Nephilim came into existence and the shocking plot that almost changed the course of history. Alright, so before we dive into the bigger picture, let's break down who exactly were the Nephilim. Both the Bible and the book of Enoch give us a pretty wild story. In Genesis 6 it says, "Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose." There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. This basically tells us that supernatural beings, likely fallen angels, took human women as wives, leading to the birth of giants. These weren't just oversized people, they were terrifying. According to the book of Enoch, chapter 7, it states, "And they became pregnant, and they bare great giants, whose height was 3,000 ells, who consumed all the acquisitions of men. And when men could no longer sustain them, the giants turned against them and devoured mankind." So these Nephilim weren't just massive. They were destructive, consuming everything in their path. And when resources ran out, they actually began devouring humans. These offspring weren't your average Joes. They were part human, part supernatural, and entirely problematic. The world was literally falling apart because of these beings. Now I know what you're thinking. What does all of this have to do with the birth of Jesus? Trust me, it's all connected, and it's about to get even more interesting. Now, to truly understand this idea, we always have to go back to the beginning where everything started. The garden. The story of the Nephilim and their corruption doesn't start with them. It goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. You see, the Nephilim weren't just about physical destruction. They were part of a much bigger spiritual battle. And it all began with a curse. Remember the story in Genesis when Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree? Everything was perfect in the garden until Satan, in the form of a serpent, came to ruin it all. He convinced Eve to eat the forbidden fruit, and that one act brought sin into the world. When God confronted Adam, Eve, and the serpent after the fall, he didn't just punish Adam and Eve, he cursed the serpent too. And this curse, well, it gave us the first glimpse of God's ultimate plan to defeat Satan. In Genesis 3, God says to the serpent, "Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." Now, did you catch it? Let's repeat the important part again for the people in the back. "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." God wasn't just talking about snakes slithering on their bellies forever. This was a prophecy. The seed of the woman that would crush the serpent's head is a direct reference to the coming Messiah, Jesus. God was letting Satan know right from the start that one day a descendant of Eve would defeat him. Sure, Satan might bruise his heel, which refers to Jesus' suffering. But ultimately the Messiah would crush Satan's head, signifying his defeat. Now Satan is smart, and he understood what this meant. He knew his defeat was coming, but he didn't know exactly when or through whom. So what did he do? He tried to stop it before it even started. Now, if you're not familiar with these ancient texts, you might be asking, how do we know for sure that Satan tried to stop the pure line of humanity? Well, the Bible, the book of Enoch, and even the book of Adam and Eve give us some pretty compelling clues. Let's start at the beginning. In Genesis, after Adam and Eve were banished from the Garden of Eden, they had two sons, Cain and Abel. Now Cain, the firstborn, was a farmer, while Abel, the second son, was a shepherd. When it came time to present offerings to God, Abel gave the best of what he had, the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions, while Cain brought some fruits from the soil. God accepted Abel's offering, but Cain's not so much. And that's where the tension begins. Cain, full of jealousy and anger, killed his brother Abel. But why Abel? Why not Cain? Here's where Satan's strategy starts to become clear. Satan didn't just try to kill Abel because he felt like it. No, he saw Abel as a direct threat because Abel was pure in heart and loved by God. If you were Satan and you wanted to stop your own destruction, would you target the righteous one or the corrupt one? Obviously, you'd go for the one with the purest lineage, the one who might be in line to carry the seed that God mentioned in Genesis 3, the one who would crush Satan's head. But Satan didn't stop there. Not only did he inspire Cain to kill Abel, but he also led Cain further away from God. Cain didn't repent. Instead, he ran off, built his own city, and his descendants became just as corrupt as he was. This wasn't just a murder. This was Satan's attempt to eliminate any possibility of righteousness continuing through Abel's line and to corrupt Cain's future generations. But then, as always, God had a plan. God turned things around with the birth of Seth. In Genesis 4:25 it says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and named him Seth. For God has appointed another seed for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed." Seth became the new hope for continuing the pure lineage. But Satan wasn't done. According to the book of Adam and Eve, the devil tried to tempt Seth from a young age, attempting to lead him astray, just like Cain. But Seth remained strong, refusing to be corrupted. This was a key moment in the spiritual battle because Satan had already succeeded with Cain. Seth, however, remained righteous, and his descendants carried that righteousness forward, at least for a while. As Seth's descendants grew, so did Cain's. And here's where things get even more interesting. According to the book of Adam and Eve, Cain's descendants became increasingly corrupt, engaging in sinful activities and turning their backs on God. But Seth's line remained pure, living on what is described as a holy mountain, separated from the corruption below. They remained obedient to God, resisting the temptations that Cain's descendants fell into. In the book of Adam and Eve 12, we learn that Cain's generation continued to seduce Seth's descendants into sin. The text says, "And the children of Seth looked on the daughters of Cain's children, and they were captivated by their beauty, and they began to desire them." This wasn't just a physical attraction. It was the beginning of spiritual corruption, a slow but steady process of leading the righteous away from God. Now here's where Satan's plan really starts to unfold. According to both Genesis and the book of Enoch, the final nail in the coffin came when the sons of God, interpreted as fallen angels or watchers, descended to earth and took human wives. Genesis 6:2 says, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose." These unions resulted in the birth of the Nephilim, giants who were not just physically imposing but spiritually corrupt. The book of Adam and Eve describes this period as the moment when Seth's descendants were finally led astray. After resisting for so long, they descended from their holy mountain and began to mix with the descendants of Cain, falling into the same sinful behaviors: drunkenness, idolatry, violence, and immorality. This was Satan's goal all along, to corrupt humanity both physically and spiritually, and to pollute the lineage from which the Messiah would come. This was a turning point in history. These unholy unions led to the defilement of Seth's once pure lineage, opening the door for further corruption. As a result, the offspring of these unions were not only physically strong, but spiritually compromised, contributing to the increasing moral decay and widespread wickedness that began to cover the earth. When Seth's line was corrupted, it marked a significant victory for Satan. But if you're wondering, how do we know Satan truly succeeded in this plan? Well, the answer is clear. God flooded the entire world. Genesis 6 says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart." This powerful verse shows that Satan's corruption had taken root so deeply that the entire human race, except for one family, had become morally bankrupt. God decided to wipe the slate clean with the flood. But there was one exception, Noah. But you might be thinking, why Noah? Well, Genesis 6:9 gives us the answer. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. Noah's purity wasn't just about his personal righteousness. It was about preserving the bloodline through which the Messiah, Jesus, would one day come. Satan's mission was to corrupt humanity to the point where the promised Messiah couldn't come into existence. But despite his efforts, God ensured that Noah's line, a pure and unblemished lineage, would survive the flood. And from this lineage, Jesus, the flawless lamb, the perfect sacrifice without blemish, would one day be born, fulfilling God's promise and ensuring Satan's ultimate defeat. Through Noah, Seth's line continued, paving the way for the birth of the Messiah thousands of years later. Seth's descendants are the thread that ties this whole story together. They represent the righteous lineage that Satan wanted to corrupt. The Nephilim, by marrying into Seth's line, were an attempt to pollute the bloodline, making it impossible for the Messiah to be born. But God's intervention through the flood ensured that Seth's line survived, keeping the hope for a future Redeemer alive. It's important to understand that the flood didn't mark the end of Satan's efforts to derail God's plan. In fact, the flood was just one chapter in a much larger ongoing spiritual battle. After the flood, humanity had a fresh start, but Satan didn't stop his attempts to corrupt and thwart the arrival of the Messiah. Even after God cleansed the earth through the flood, Satan's influence continued to creep back in through various nations and empires. He knew that the Messiah was prophesied to come from the line of Noah, specifically through the descendants of Shem. So what did he do? He tried to corrupt future generations, introduce idolatry, and lead entire nations astray. We see this time and time again throughout the Old Testament, where nations and even God's chosen people, Israel, fell into sin and idolatry. Think of the rise of pagan nations, the worship of false gods, and how Israel was constantly under attack spiritually and physically. Satan's goal remained the same, to prevent the birth of the Messiah, the seed of the woman who would one day crush his head. Despite all of these efforts, God's promise remained intact. No matter how hard Satan tried to derail God's plan, the lineage leading to Jesus was preserved. We see glimpses of this even in prophetic writings. For instance, in Isaiah 7:14 it says, "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel." This was a direct prophecy of the coming Messiah, a sign that despite Satan's best efforts, God's plan would come to fruition. The flood wasn't the final victory. It was just one step in a much larger divine story leading to Jesus. Now that was a lot to unpack, so let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. The Nephilim were never part of God's original plan. When God created the world, he designed it with a perfect purpose for humanity. But the whole thing with the sons of God taking human wives? Yeah, that wasn't in the divine blueprint. The Nephilim's existence was a direct violation of the natural order God had established. And of course Satan, being the master of chaos, took full advantage of the Watchers' rebellion to advance his own twisted agenda. So why was Satan so obsessed with stopping the Messiah? Remember that prophecy from Genesis 3:15? It foretold that the seed of the woman, who we now know as Jesus, would crush the serpent's head. That prophecy marked Satan's doom. He knew his defeat was inevitable and that the Messiah would be the one to seal his fate. By corrupting humanity and creating the Nephilim, Satan hoped to derail God's plan, particularly by tainting the human gene pool and preventing the birth of the Messiah. But despite Satan's relentless efforts, God preserved a pure lineage through Noah. In Genesis 6:9 in KJV it says, "Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations, and Noah walked with God." This statement highlights Noah's purity, both in his character and his lineage, untouched by the corruption of the Nephilim. God's plan remained intact, and through Noah's descendants, Jesus, who would later become the perfect sinless sacrifice, was born. And we know that in order for Jesus to be the ultimate sacrifice, he had to be spotless, without blemish. He was the Lamb of God who came to take away the sins of the world. So there you have it, the real reason the Nephilim came into existence. It wasn't just a random act of rebellion, it was Satan's desperate attempt to prevent the birth of the Messiah and stop God's redemptive plan. But in the end, God's purpose prevailed. The flood wiped out the Nephilim, preserving Noah's lineage. And through that pure line, the Messiah was born. And as for Satan, well, his plan failed just as God promised. Jesus crushed the serpent's head, securing victory over sin and death. As we've seen, the story of the Nephilim is much more than just an ancient tale. It's a testament to the spiritual battle that's been waged since the beginning of time. But no matter how hard the enemy tries to interfere, God's plan always prevails. The birth of the Messiah was unstoppable, and through Jesus we have victory over sin and darkness. So, as we reflect on this incredible story, remember that God's plans for you are just as powerful, and nothing can stand in the way of His purpose for your life. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay blessed.